Leading stories, trending topics, changing narratives. You're listening to the Critical Conversations podcast.
Welcome to the Critical Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rick Daniels, Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion at Oakton College. Today, we explore the hidden cost of free speech. Recent events have brought this classic topic back to the forefront, and together, we'll unpack the national sentiment, the impact on the student experience, and how we respond to various forms of campus expression, as well as how we, the Oakton community, tell our story to the broader community. I am joined by three special guests today, and I want to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your role at the college, and then we'll kick it off. Keith, you're no stranger to the show. Let's start with you.
Thanks for having me back. My name is Keith Simonds, and I teach political science here at Oakton.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Crawford, Professor of English at Oakton.
Good afternoon. Steve Butera, Director of Communication and External Relations. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for being here today. I appreciate having all of you. We've got two returners and we've got one first-time guest. So, Steve, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Let's get into it, Keith. You pretty much got a segment on this podcast at this point. So I want to start with you and ask about the historical perspective around free speech, particularly in higher education. Tell us about some of the key moments that have led to this moment that we're having right now. Tell us about how the ways in which free speech has impacted higher ed and how that has gotten us to where we are.
Well, free speech in the United States is really very controversial right from the beginning. One of the first big conflicts in the United States between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans is around the Sedition Act. So essentially, the government really did try to make criticism of the federal government and its policies illegal. And this led to huge controversy at the time. And this is just less than 10 years after the actual ratification of the First Amendment, which of course includes free speech protections. As we developed as a country, we've had many, many Supreme Court cases that have tried to find the line for speech, including speech on college campuses. Very famously, a lot of the most intense battles over free speech, for example, in the 1960s, took place on the campus of Berkeley, where you had massive protests. You had protests about the Vietnam War. You had protests specifically about free speech. And we've had just sort of this constant back and forth push and pull over the issue of how much control the government should have over people's ability to express themselves. This has often been most intense in times of war, conflict, but it's something that we keep coming back to, and that we would literally sometimes set a precedent and that would change just 3 years later at the Supreme Court. So it's just this constant ebb and flow that we have never fully settled. And certainly things like social media have only made that more complicated than recent times.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a higher ed perspective, how has that in the larger society impacted how college campuses govern themselves during these kinds of times?
Well, so one of the most intense periods certainly would be during the Cold War in the United States between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where college campuses saw real restrictions on both academic freedom and questions about what kind of activism students would be allowed to engage in became very forefront in the mind of many policymakers. And in many instances, the push and pull that I already mentioned is about this question of how much expression should we allow without it starting to interfere with the other things we're trying to accomplish.
Right.
So one very famous case is the Tinker case, where high school students had worn black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And the court basically said that that was not a problem in and of itself, but because it caused so many other students to get upset and created fights and other problems in the hallways, that they could shut down that speech because it was so disruptive to education itself. So the question of sort of disruption versus free expression is really key here.
So kind of like the whole fire in a crowded room scenario, right?
Right. So that the fire in a crowded theater is from the Schenck case, which this is during World War I. And the big issue here is you have a lot of particularly anarchists and socialists who are opposed to World War I, who are discouraging men from being willing to fight in the military, who oppose the First World War, and they get arrested and charged for sort of interfering with government tasks and responsibilities related to the war. So that comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who makes this argument that this is an example that we have to be able to curtail speech at certain points. He actually later sort of walks this back. And so the fire in a crowded theater example he specifically says if you have to be dishonestly saying it, in his opinion. But it's also one of these things that's not terribly helpful as an analogy, because in many instances we're talking about people trying to express their opinions. And so the truth or non-truth of the statement doesn't actually help us sort of resolve the conflict.
Yeah, even if you're in a crowded theater.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Professor Will, I want to come to you and talk about the classroom. Tell me about how the larger sentiments around free speech in society right now may be impacting students' experiences in the classroom from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that for my personal experience, definitely this semester, I've told students, really stress to them. I do this at the beginning of the semester, but just in general, this semester, I specifically have told students to make sure to think about how they're expressing themselves, to take in consideration their words, and even outside of my classroom or outside of our class, and thinking about in their own spaces, right? Taking in consideration how something that they say might be interpreted. So, and also thinking about what they really want to get across.
Yeah.
And I think that in general, in terms of thinking about higher education and freedom of speech, I definitely think that for students, for faculty, for institutions in general, this is a time where we have to be reflective, that we have to, as we're doing here right now, like question what that means in terms of not just in the classroom, but on the college campus as a whole. I think that definitely in terms of us just being able to recognize, I like what you said, and looking at the last or listening to the last podcast, that we have to see each other as human beings.
Yeah.
And
who's on the human on the other side of that statement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that this is really like our responsibility in terms of being or holding on to freedom of speech and what that entails.
Have you ever had to intervene in a classroom setting when you had someone who may have been intentionally or maybe even unintentionally engaging in speech that could be considered hurtful or harmful or maybe change the environment in the classroom? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yes, I have. So typically it's been something of where the student, as you said, unintentionally might have said something that was close to being offensive or just kind of short-sighted. So I would definitely in those moments kind of say, like, hold up, let's think about it. As what you're saying,
just unpack it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think that you really are thinking about this rather, or talking about this in a very this complex topic? I teach African American literature. I teach intro to fiction. I teach humanities, African American culture, and the arts. And so sometimes there are complicated topics that will come up, or just interpretations, right? And so wanting students and also telling them that I really try to hold myself to that standard as well, right? That sometimes please let me know, right? If there's something that I'm saying or the way that I'm presenting it that you feel is a little short-sighted or just not really, as you said, needs to be unpacked, feel free to let me know. So yeah, I've done that. And I've just typically when that moment has happened with students, usually it's one to diffuse and that they accept it or they understand it. And it's not a thing of like the next class, the student doesn't want to come to class. But just, again, going back to what I said originally, I want to make sure that our students feel safe, right? And that they feel safe in terms of being able to speak their minds or having freedom of speech or being able to interpret something and share their thoughts. But also understanding, too, that they have a responsibility to their colleagues, to themselves for that matter, just in terms of making sure that what you're saying or how you're saying it is being expressed in a way that is just that, right?
Yeah.
Fully and responsibly.
Absolutely. Responsible. That's a good segue into the next question. I want to come to you, Steve, and then I have a question for us that hopefully we can all be more involved in. But you're integral in telling the campus story and telling the Oakton story, particularly to the broader community. How do you believe the current national sentiment around this topic is impacting how we tell our story to the public?
Well, it's just such a hyper polarized environment that we have to be aware of, and things that we wouldn't have thought that could be taken as offensive or as hurtful as little as 5 or 10 years ago. Now we really have to be intentional when we examine our words and we tell our stories. I interface with students much less than Professor Crawford and Professor Simonds, and you particularly in your last role. But I enjoy those opportunities when I have those opportunities. And what we are very intentional about particularly within the marketing and communications area, is allowing our students to be the champions of their own story. When we engage with students, it's critical that in every phase of the story development process and the dissemination process, that they are aware of how they are being portrayed and what facts about their student experience and their lives are being shared, and that they have the opportunity to review those, to provide input, and have final sign off, both in photo, video, written, what have you. So our marketing and communications colleagues, particularly our content marketing team, have championed our inclusive storytelling guidelines with that focus, allowing our students to be the champions of those stories. And our classroom extends, right? It extends onto our website. It extends onto our social media channels, and it extends even into our external media and advocacy opportunities with elected officials and donors and other community stakeholders. So positioning our students as the champion of their own stories, and Oakton as the supporting character, right, that's allowing them to move towards their goals is center all the time.
Absolutely. I really subscribe to that. I've told this story before about my experiences being involved as an ambassador for campus, if you will, and feeling like in some ways my story was exploited, and to some degree, my speech was violated, right? I was told almost specifically what to say, how to say it. And so I think that there's something to be said for how we tell our own story. We do know that there is a concerted attack on some very specific words that we use, very specific phrases and things that we rely on. But I want to talk about scenarios that may happen in real time. There may be a campus expression or a campus protest or a form of free speech or expression that happens here. It's happened here in the past. My question is, if you were to find yourself in a situation where like a protest broke out in your classroom or something like that, or you were sort of near some sort of expression or a form of expression that happened, how do you handle that? What do you do? What's the first thing that happens? How do you take authority, or how do you connect in a moment like that?
Well, I can say that I haven't personally experienced anything quite like that happening, but because I teach politics, stuff comes up all the time where there's the potential, at least, for, kind of conflict. One of the main things that I think colleges and sort of culturally we can do is taking the idea of free speech simply as debate out of our sort of lexicon. Because I do think one of the things that happens is when
those two aren't one and the same.
Right. Well, I think the problem is when we think of everything about sort of speech as debate, is then we're just sort of encouraging arguing with each other as the way to experience free speech.
Okay, can I pause you right there real quick?
Please.
Will, tap in right there. What do you think about that in relationship to the subject you teach, English?
Yeah, I was just listening to Keith and going back, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but in terms of thinking, well, one, about debate and definitely freedom of speech. And teaching African-American literature, what I was thinking about was just how there's this concerted effort that certain types of history not be taught, right? Even, well, of course, when we're talking about public education, and even now, I think more so like when we look at certain departments or programs at colleges, whether they are 2-year or 4-year, that those are being questioned. There's a concerted effort to like quiet those voices, right? And so for me personally, and I've told my students, particularly this semester, that they should be aware that they are in some way, for some people, they have a perspective that we are participating in something as far as our education, the content of the course that is seen as being problematic. But I told them, if anything, because you're here, I'm assuming that you want to be part of this discussion. Right. And also that it's important to you, and that it's important for us to make sure that this type of education, not just for African-American literature, Asian American literature, anything across the board in terms of a diversity, Latinx, anything that challenges the status quo in terms of what's seen as acceptable. And so in that way, we are bringing in not only freedom of speech, but then going back to Keith's point in terms about debate in terms of the content, in terms of, again, interpretations or questions. But I understand what you're saying definitely about. I think those are mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah. And so let's come back to that. Thanks for letting me do a segue right there. The difference between speech and debate. Do you ever have to broach that in your classroom? Do you ever find that in discussions you may have to sometimes serve as a guidepost for people when speech may be interfering, or the debate may be interfering with the speech? Kind of tell me about the way you foster human-centered dialogue in your classroom.
Right. Well, one of the ways I think about it is that debate is very useful for lots of things, but there's a lot of ways to win debates that aren't actually engaging in very productive speech. And so we want to have situations in our classrooms where students feel very comfortable expressing what they think, and that includes disagreeing. But that if everything just turns into a who can win in this moment, then we're missing the larger picture. And so in my classroom, when they talk about issues they care about, which I encourage, they have projects where they have to have an argument for why they think they should address a problem a certain way in American government. I want them to be very specific, and they have to specifically look for arguments against their perspective and talk about why they don't agree with those arguments.
Right.
But making it very policy specific, as opposed to, as unfortunately happens in many of our political debates, just saying the person making that argument is bad or that argument is inherently bad, as opposed to actually trying to engage with the person. Free speech, gives us the right to say lots of terrible things in terms of the legal sort of structure that we have. It does not mean that that's what we always want to be doing. And so trying to balance the idea that, yes, we want people not to feel overly restricted in what they say, but we don't want students being hurt about what they hear. And certainly in our classrooms, we're always talking about things that impact people personally in ways we don't know about.
Yeah,
and so we want to keep that in mind as just one of many things that is happening when we talk about these issues.
Yeah. So deep rooted. I want to come to the social media conversation, not just social media, but message boarding discussions, digital discussions that we may have on the platforms in our classroom. Do you experience that there's sometimes free speech issues that come up in those spaces as well? And Steve, I'll kick this one off with you, particularly with how we deal with social media comments, posts, and things of that nature. And then for our faculty, I would love to hear about how you may handle that on D2L or some of the other areas in which you may engage students in the written form.
Well, social media has certainly evolved in its uses since it emerged probably 15 to 20 years ago, whether it was originally just a forum for posting status updates, as we used to call them, or personal photos, then to the uglier discourse that we've grown to see on some channels, particularly with the colleges channels. It's something that we've been very intentional about. And again, to the point of drafting and developing guidelines for monitoring comments and having specific criteria for when comments can be turned off if they become harmful or abrasive to a point where a discussion is no longer useful in any way, right? But often the default, at least from the college, is to honor the free speech and allow most comments to remain on our social media channels as they would on personal social media channels as well, even if they are a negative response to something that the college post or something that another person post in response to a college post or tag the college, but certainly very intentional to walk that line between not having it devolve into a discourse where it's an attack on a person or vulgarity, profanity, discriminatory behavior, but certainly a lot of nuance, and an area where we found as we develop these protocols that often it's a case by case basis, right?
It really is.
This particular comment was said. Do we leave it? Do we respond to it? Is there grounds for removing it where it doesn't fit neatly into a box, right? Because there's so much nuance. But I anticipate that those will continue over time as social media continues to evolve over time. And in some ways, we have to be the thought leader.
Right. Yeah.
Stay true to our institutional values. And I think that should be our guiding North Star in most cases, right? Does this continue the dialogue in a way that stays true to Oakton's mission?
Yeah. Excellent. Well stated. What about in the classroom on some of the message boards or some of the other platforms that you might engage in?
Yeah, I personally haven't had any experience with students in terms of message boarding or D2L with discussions saying something that was inappropriate or that might be seen as offensive. But I also, at the same time, just in kind of somewhat tangential response to your question, is that we have to think about this in a broader sense about how much not only our students, but we ourselves, obviously with social media, sports commentators, right, that we are so driven by, going back to the key word, right, or a word that's being used today, debate, right? It's like everything is about a debate, whether it's about what someone is wearing, what's in style today, what
they're not wearing.
Right, what they're not wearing, what's the best diet to take or have. It's just so driven by just this notion of like, I've got the best take on this and so forth. And so we can be somewhat give grace to a certain degree where it's appropriate, right? That understanding that our students are having this experience day in and day out, right? In some form or fashion, whether it's social media, whether it's pop culture, they're constantly bombarded with and participating in this. And we are in our own ways participating in it as well. So also, again, just being reflective and taking that moment to just question ourselves regarding it.
I agree. Let me get your thoughts on this too, because I think there's a few other layers. I feel like there's speech, there's discussion, there's debate, and then there's argument. And then after the argument comes the dehumanization. If you're past arguing at this point, we're fighting at that point, and I'm just trying to dehumanize you. How do you know when a conversation, whether it be in the classroom or a conversation you may be having with another colleague or a student or what have you, how do you know when it's entered into the argument space? Because I'm not necessarily against someone approaching, we're not against, but I can understand how sometimes people may approach speech as debate. But I think the confusion comes from debate and arguments, right? I know some people who don't know how to have a debate without positioning it as an argument. And then that leads the receiver to react and respond in a certain way. From your perspective, being the professionals you are, how do you know how to handle that when you've gone from one space to another?
I think one way to think about it is, and I think this is a little harder to do on online classes, although I think you can do it there too, is the more that the group you're talking about feels like an actual community, the better they're going to do in these kinds of moments. So that,
say more about that.
Well, that even if they do get to that arguing stage, that they can pull back and see that, why am I, getting angry at this person who's just trying to, express their feelings? And that's something that's hard on some topics more so than others. But the more they know each other, because I do think one of the biggest problems on social media is when people are fully anonymous, their willingness to
don't know these people.
To say really, really awful things is so much stronger. And that even if you're not seeing the person, you're like on an online asynchronous class, having read their other discussion posts where they introduce themselves and talk about their life a little bit, when people are explaining their own experiences, I think that starts to help prevent escalation to where we're getting not into a non-productive form of speech. But I think it is tricky, especially even if they're not the ones engaging in it, as social media gets more and more filled with those kinds of attitudes and that kind of debate, we're all impacted by it, even if we're not engaging in it directly. So I think us trying to, and Will made this point earlier, that we have to show through the way we act in our classrooms and the way we talk about things and willingness to listen to other students in the classroom that we are trying to live those values as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I asked, like, what are some of the de-escalation tactics or ways in which you know how to navigate those kinds of tough conversations, whether they happen digitally or in person?
Yeah, I think it's just definitely just asking questions, right? Asking them to think about what you're saying or how you're saying it. Or again, just, are you being kind of narrow in terms of what you either are thinking or how you're thinking about this or how you're at least presenting it within this particular context? I think that gives the students an opportunity to just, as I said before, like step back and reflect on it. So if anything, that's, I think, one way that I definitely go about it, wanting students to like question themselves, question the moment, right?
Yeah.
Because there's that opportunity for them and then also for the class. It's never trying to, just kind of going back to your question, like not shaming the student as well, right? Or shame anyone for that.
Or shutting them down.
Right, shutting them down. Yeah, right? I want them to
I've seen good people shut down rooms before, in a healthy way. Sorry.
Right. No, I think that's just it right there, right? Not wanting to make the student feel shut down in that particular moment, or they feel so embarrassed. They're like, I don't want to come back to this class. And especially at the same time, demonstrating, like showing grace, but also still stressing like you have a responsibility, right? In terms of what you say and how you say it. Right. Yeah. And so trying to have that good balance of those two things going on.
Absolutely. Steve, did you want to add something to that?
Agree with all points. Very well stated. And I think the classroom and more controlled environments, I think there's an opportunity to rein the conversation back and intentionally refocus those debates that drift off into argument mode. That's harder to do so in a non-controlled environment,
right? Whether
it be in a hallway or a public place or in a social media environment, right? Where there's not the the built-in arbiter, the professor or the debate moderator. But in some cases, right, that's when you turn off the comments online. This has devolved. We've lost the plot. And let's all cool off.
I was waiting for that to come up.
And try again tomorrow.
When do you turn the comments off?
I don't think that we've done that on the college's social media channels. You may have done that on your personal channels. I may have done that on my personal channels.
I know a few people that I've seen put up posts and it's like, why did you even have the comments on in the first place? I'm not sure. We've never had to do that before. We've never had a comment section that went on fire and we had to do something about it.
Not that I can recall, but as we talk about those comment moderation procedures, that is certainly that's certainly a tool, right, available to us, right? If there's an X number of comments on a post within a given period of time, and most of it is not advancing the conversation, it might just be better for all parties involved to move on.
Yeah, and I get that.
That's the thing with social media too. As heated as those confrontations become, and that back and forth becomes, the attention span in those spaces tends to be so limited, right, that it's often moved on to either another channel or another topic very quickly. Which
is actually quite sad because of how much hurt can be done in those comments, of how much harm can take place.
And you move on.
And and then the person on the giving end may move on, but the receiver of those comments may have to live with them.
Correct.
For a very long time. And I know that there's people out there that say, well, who cares about who says what on the internet? Actually, there's a lot of evidence to show that quite a few people care and that it can impact your psychological safety. So the whole turning off the comments thing is funny until it's not funny, right? Until it becomes a tool for safety. Let me close this out by asking one piece of advice that you would offer either students or employees in this current time, how to, in terms of navigating free speech in the current environment.
One, I think, easy sounding piece of advice that I try to take myself is to, we already talked about the desperation to have the best take or the first take, to take a moment and instead make sure you know all the facts of the thing you're getting angry about or assuming somebody else is angry about at you, so that really getting to know the facts and sort of taking more time to learn about something than to get angry about it or express your anger about, because a lot of the time we have sort of people who have half the story yelling at each other and they're never going to get the whole story that way.
Right. Well said.
As a 42-year-old man, right, when I say things or think about saying things, I often think, what would my mother think?
There you go.
And maybe it's something as simple as that, right? As we tend to veer away from that respectful discourse, right? Is this really who I am and who I want to be perceived? Who would the people that I care about feel about me? Thinking these things, speaking these things, positioning my feelings in a way that might hurt someone else, and that might help center.
Yeah. Thank you. Will.
Just embrace your freedom of speech, but just at the same time being mindful. And like I told my students, be safe, right?
Yeah.
Be safe in terms of how you are experiencing it in terms of your freedom of speech, but also at the same time, how you interact with others regarding your freedom of speech. So be safe.
Be safe. I would say the freedom of speech does not mean the freedom to offend.
Or freedom from consequence.
Yeah, or freedom of consequence of said speech. And so I have to be mindful of balancing how to express my own thoughts and opinions, but also how it impacts the larger community, how it impacts, my own personal walk and personal journey, but also the community that I work for and with every day as well. And so I think that there's been a lot that's happened in these last really 2 years that have made me become even more mindful about how I share my words and thoughts and views and opinions, and in a way that's productive. It's part of the reason why this podcast, landed here, because how do we have these kinds of conversations in a way that's healthy? This podcast was founded in an era of anti-DEI, so that's not necessarily new. But how do we do so in a way that's still safe, that allows us the freedom to express our views and opinions, but in a way that uplifts people? So freedom of speech does not constitute the freedom to offend. You can still espouse your viewpoints without having to dehumanize the person on the other side. We'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I qualify. When I say be safe, I don't want anyone to take it as being not embracing being courageous, right? In terms. So someone says, oh, he says being safe, so don't say certain things, because no, I'm just saying be safe, being mindful, but definitely feel free to be courageous in using or, again, embracing your freedom of speech.
Wise words. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Critical Conversations podcast is recorded at Oakton College, located at 1600 East Gulf Road, Des Plaines, Illinois. The show is sponsored in part by the Oakton College Educational Foundation, produced by Erick Rohn, coordinated by Brenda Cruz, and hosted by Dr. Rick Daniels. For more information or to connect with us, email critconpod@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more Critical Conversations.